Hello, friends. Welcome to my channel Dinarian. As always, at the beginning of the broadcast, I remind you subscribe, like, comment, repost. Thank you all for your support. Today, I am glad to welcome Ukrainian journalist and analyst Vitaly Portnikov to my channel again. Vitaly Eduardovich Vitayu. Glory to Ukraine. Hello, Hero Slava. Long time we have not seen. Thank you that you find time for the Kazakh audience. Vitaly E. I would like our conversation to start with your assessment of the last 10 days. Starting with the publication of the National Security Strategy of the United States. What do you see as important from what happened, and do you think there are any shifts towards the end of the war? Well, I don't really understand how the concept of national security in general is connected with the end of Dean's War. But I don't see any special moments in the concept itself that are subject to additional comment. A similar thesis we first heard from the Vice President of the United States, J. Divan's Tinskoy Conference. And in fact, they are repeated in this concept of national security. And in general, in principle, we have known this approach to foreign policy for a long time. And moreover, I would say that we know him over 100 years, because this is the isolationist approach, which dominated the American political elite between the First and Second World Wars. Then almost every incumbent politician who claimed the post of President of the United States from Republicans or Democrats had to literally publicly swear to isolationism, criticize the foreign policy approach of Woodrow Wilson, who, as you know, initiated the creation of the League of Nations and advocated an American presence in Europe, making a reasonable conclusion, based on the results of the First World War, that the security of the United States cannot be ensured if there is no security of the European continent. In America, almost no one agreed with this. Moreover, there were many representatives of the American political elite who openly sympathized with the far-right radical ideologies. I think that everyone is well aware of Henry Ford, who can be said to have written many, so to speak, the main points of Adolf Hitler's book, even before Adolf Hitler wrote this book. This is an ideological credo that should not be forgotten. Therefore, when we say, "My God, why is Elon Musk behaving like this? He is a billionaire and a man of progress, and his views are, I would say, caveman." All right, we had another billionaire man of progress, Henry Ford. No less a major personality in America, well, and he spoke with exactly the same views, there is nothing new. Or let's recall the career of Joseph Kennedy's sister, the father of the future American president, and the future American Attorney General. But Joseph Kennedy's sister did not hide his sympathies for authoritarian practices. As the ambassador of the United States of Great Britain, he advised the British to negotiate with Hitler, was sure of their defeat, in much the same way that Vitkov now advises Zelensky to negotiate with the Putins, convinces, as far as I understand, Donald Trump that Ukraine has no chance. This wasn't new either. What has changed? It's just that the Second World War has come. The United States tried to the last not to participate in the war in Europe. They didn't really understand that this war already meant insecurity for them, because the Reich has allies in Asia. Even after Pearl Harbor, one of the main issues discussed at a meeting of Secretary Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet was how not to get involved in a war with Germany. Moreover, it was decided not to declare war with Germany even after Germany was able, being an ally of Japan, obviously did not sympathize with the United States, even when Japan and the United States were already at war. I always remind you, it was not Franklin Roosevelt who declared war on Adolf Hitler. It was Adolf Hitler who declared war on Franklin Roosevelt and the United States of America. Just as it was not Joseph Stalin who declared war on Adolf Hitler. He was never going to fight with them. Adolf Hitler declared war on Joseph Stalin, who continued to consider the Führer his ally, almost until the morning of the 22nd of June, 1941st year. Therefore, the American elite drew conclusions. But now these conclusions are essentially over, as we understand. And all those moods that we observed in the United States in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, which we now know only from textbooks, have returned. Here we find ourselves in this tutorial, old stories. Does this have anything to do with reality? No, it doesn't. It doesn't matter, because you and I can look at the geographical map better, so to speak, and more effectively than President Trump. Well, we're talking to you. I'm from Kyiv, are you from Almaty? From Almaty, come on. Yes, you are from Almaty. These are different continents. Sort of. But is there some kind of ocean between us, between Ukraine and Kazakhstan? There is some kind of big sea border. No, this is the subcontinent, Eurasia. Instability in Europe is also instability in Asia. It's just a formula of geography, not politics. And instability in Asia always comes to the fact that there is a threat to the United States from the Pacific Ocean. And now it is exactly the same disposition, exactly the same as it was before the Second World War, during the Second World War. There is Russia with its geopolitical ambitions, and there is China, which is an ally of Russia with its geopolitical ambitions. Between Russia and China, there is no ocean. They border, there is a common border of the state between them. This is essentially one subcontinent, I repeat again. Only China, with this, I would say, a sting of ambition, goes to the Pacific Ocean. As Japan once went to the Pacific Ocean with its ambitions before World War II, being a great military power. Just now China has replaced it in this role. Therefore, any bets that we do not need Europe, the Russian-Ukrainian war is your personal business. And we will focus on Latin America. These are absolutely childish representations of reality that have nothing to do with genuine problems. And history will finally, I think, judge all this literally in the next few years. Maybe this strategy was the last confirmation of the US position towards Ukraine, towards Europe, I'm sorry. And Europe needed to hear it again to understand. Well, I think that Europe has already heard this after J. Devon's speech, but again, listen. Protocol documents in general have no meaning in politics. What really matters is what can be done, you know. Therefore, these are all these concepts, strategies. It's all very good when it can really be brought to life. It's just an absolutely meaningless document that will be forgotten like many other documents. Moreover, we are well aware that the person who inspired this document in general, and for whom it was written, Donald Trump. He did not read it, he does not read the documents. Well, there is a certain beautiful form of dressing Donald Trump's beliefs in some scientific documents. It doesn't matter. The Europeans already understand everything perfectly. I say again, they understand this from Vance's Munich speech. Nothing new has happened at all and has not been heard. After Vance's Munich speech, it was possible to draw simple conclusions. Either you and I are thinking about ensuring the security of Europe, or we agree that we will wait. Suddenly everything in the United States will magically change. As you can see, so far there is no need to count on any real changes. Therefore, the Europeans are working to strengthen their defense capability. They are thinking how to help Ukraine in this difficult situation, but they can't do everything in one day. You understand, if the concept of European security has always been based on the Euro-Atlantic idea. If Americans have always assured the Europeans that they need for the security that they provide to the United States for the umbrella, relatively speaking. Pay. Yes, you are increasing your defense spending, please, but you are not producing weapons. Buy it from us. By the way, and now some Trump administration officials are saying, why are they producing weapons? And why do they have that don't buy? This is wrong. And then it turned out that the United States did not want to be the umbrella of Europe's security. Now under Trump, 8 decades after the Second World War, it is clear that in order to rebuild the military industry, in order to understand what is happening with the armies, in order to understand how to balance the economy in this situation in general, it takes time. And I don't think that this is any reason, let's say, to blame the Europeans for falling asleep there, waking up. And I hear this very often. Europe has finally woken up. Why should she have been in a different situation if she was sure that there was a state across the ocean? That had always convinced the Europeans itself. By itself. After the Second World War, that we are together, we made conclusions. Your safety, our safety. Why it was necessary to be sure that American voters would elect a person who had lost his adequacy as president. Moreover, this man, the first time was president, did not look so convinced anti-evolutionists. He, of course, there spoke about the need to raise the money, part of the gross national product of European countries, in order to protect Europe together more, so to speak, coordinated, that America should not have to pay for everything. But it's all completely sober and clear position. I completely agree with this. You can see that Donald Trump has made some irreversible changes in the Oval Office during his absence. I would say of a psychological nature, so as not to go into any attempts to make a diagnosis there without being a doctor. No, these are psychological changes, perhaps related to the loss of power. Perhaps related to the fear of some kind of imprisonment and retribution, but the person in this case changes, okay. He becomes somewhat different, surrounds himself with other people, wants to live in a more comfortable world, where everyone will only say nice things to him and not contradict him. Because he may have such, I would say, well, a more complicated feeling from the first term of the presidency. Why did they argue and swear with him there, and why be as a president in such an uncomfortable situation? It's better to be comfortable. But this is something. But again, this has nothing to do with politics, it has to do with Trump's psychology. And the Europeans will have to draw conclusions. I think it's better to draw conclusions than to assume that in 2029 year, all this will crumble, they're like a house of cards. Or maybe it won't crumble. Or maybe the next president of the United States will be the next far-right politician, after all. We don't know whether J. Devens proclaimed all these theses from the rostrum of the Munich conference, because he is just an opportunist who wants to get the crown from the hands of Donald Trump, become his heir. Or because he is a convinced politician of ultra-right views. It will be possible to understand this only because after they get rid of Trump, not before. In general, have you highlighted anything important for yourself over the past week? No, I don't think there is anything remotely going on in any direction at all. Go into the processes that actually started in January 2025 year, when Donald Trump became president of the United States. But they have quite obviously the same vector of development. So far, we have not seen any, so to speak, squiggles. Last Saturday, a meeting of Zelensky and Ukraine's European allies with the American side was supposed to take place in Paris. But it was cancelled. And tomorrow Zelensky, Starmer, Macron and Merz are meeting in Berlin with Kushner and Witkoff. Axios informs that it will be about holding a referendum on the peace agreement. So instead of looking for a solution to end the war, negotiations are now being used as pressure on Ukraine. Well, you see again, I believe that all this is such a performance that does not have any special significance. If Russia has no real desire to end the war. Do you understand? And when we say that the main task is, so to speak, the solution of territorial issues, we need to find out, but how does Russia feel about this in general? As far as Russia really believes that the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the territory of the Donetsk region, which Russia cannot conquer, is a step towards ending the war. And what will really happen to the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, which are also annexed by Russia, are inscribed in its constitution? Well, that is, there are a lot of different questions that you can naturally look for answers to, but I always say that if the parties do not talk about a ceasefire, they talk about some kind of peace agreement that needs to be sought. It means that there is no end to the war, and you can correct the point. All this talk about referendums. But listen, I don't really understand how a referendum can be held under martial law. In order to abolish martial law, hold some kind of referendum, hold presidential or parliamentary elections. It is necessary to abolish martial law, prepare for all these issues. I'm not talking about anything else, but you will hold a referendum. And the majority of Ukrainian voters will speak out against alienating Donbass. What will you do next after that? Well, it's not the president who decides, but the people decide, and the people can be completely different than the president. Then, there is another very important point of a legal nature. Yes, we have one of the articles of the Constitution, which suggests that issues of territorial integrity can be resolved only by referendum. In other words, neither the president nor the parliament can make decisions on these issues. But at the same time, there is also an eternal provision of the Constitution, which indicates that no actions can be taken related to the violation of human rights and freedoms of a citizen and violation of the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and the territorial integrity of the country. This is an eternal position that negates the results of any referendum. There are norms of international law that state that no referendums on alienation of territory can be held in a state of occupation or annexation. Therefore, even if we imagine that any referendum will actually take place on the territory of Ukraine, even imagine that this referendum will end with the majority of people expressing their support for the transfer of the territory of any Ukrainian regions to Russia, and renouncing the presence of these regions in the Constitution of Ukraine. Even if we assume that there is a constitutional court that will approve these conclusions, not a referendum, but a parliament. Well, I'm not saying that the parliament should adopt such changes in 2 separate sessions. Again, this cannot be done during martial law. The Constitution explicitly prohibits changes during martial law. Directly prohibits it. Nothing can be done while martial law. Here, even if there is 150 referendum. So, even if all this happens, any next leader of Ukraine will be able to cancel the results of this referendum. Any parliamentary state donations as legally null and void, from the point of view of the relevant eternal provisions in the Constitution. Therefore, all this talk is about nothing. And even if we agree in the 25th year that these territories belong to Russia in the 30th year, we can clearly return them to the Ukrainian Constitution, even without holding any referendums. There is no legal solution that would really lead to the fact that we will give up our territories, and there will not be. And Russians should know that these territories will never be considered Russian anyway, even if a referendum of some kind takes place. And the majority of the population will think so. We will always be able to bring the next referendum, which will simply cancel the results of the previous one, according to constitutional norms. And we will always be able to bring to justice those who participated in the preparation of the previous referendum, as people who are responsible for the violation of territorial integrity from the outside. It's very simple, in my opinion. It's very simple. So look for the solution in the legal field is meaningless, Dinara, you know. It doesn't exist. Yes, I understand. And do Witkov and Kushner understand this? About what? And they don't care. They want to somehow end the war, execute Trump's order. I'll tell you this, Witkov and Kushner want to fulfill Trump's location. Zelensky and the Europeans want Trump not to accuse them of disrupting the peace process at the suggestion of Witkov and Kushner. And they expect that it will come to some point when the Russians themselves will refuse this decision. And I have almost no doubts. That's the whole tactic. And if you look at the situation like this, well, suppose Putin understands perfectly well that according to the laws of Ukraine, neither a referendum nor elections can be held in your country. But he doesn't care, because Trump will be angry when he is refused. In other words, he will not be able to give these conditions for election security. And when he gets angry, he will simply refuse the help that is needed. Well, it can be anything, but why should Trump get angry just like that? He should already have a reason to be angry. If we say that we are ready to hold elections, just let them help us with security. You're not even Trump to provide us with security. He should contact Putin, offer him this option. Let's stop the fire for 3 months so that they can hold elections, so that they have a legitimate leadership. Really. If Putin refuses, let Putin tell Trump that he can't. Let Trump be angry at Putin. Why should he be angry at us? If we are ready to hold elections. But this. We can even create a legal basis for holding elections. We can even create some kind of legal framework. I don't really understand how all this will work for holding elections under martial law. Only we all need security. We can't hold elections in the conditions of rocket attacks, do you understand? And tell me, how will you hold elections now in Odessa, where there is no light at all to heating? How do I do this? It probably needs to be restored somehow. Well, so that people can go to some polling stations, at least read the names of candidates in the light. But I'm serious. I understand, of course. There you go. Not to mention. About, well, if Trump refuses to help, then he will refuse. What should I do? We can't get out of our skin. I don't think he will refuse to help. You understand that if Trump refuses to provide Ukraine with intelligence assistance and firms selling European weapons to Ukraine, American weapons for European money, then he will not be able to mediate in this war. Then he will not be of interest to anyone, not only to us, but also to Putin, if he does not participate in anything. Why someone would be considered? Thus, relations between Russia and Europe will come to the fore then, right? Well, then what will Putin talk about with Trump? Trump can't cancel sanctions anyway, he can't unblock assets. He has also stopped helping Ukraine. What is his influence on the process? Do you want a Nobel Prize? The Nobel Prize doesn't matter at all. Again, these are children's desires that are outside politics. Yesterday, the Washington Post published information that the Secretary of the National Security Council of Ukraine Rustem Umerov also held closed meetings with FBI Director Kash Patel and his deputy Dan Bangina during trips to negotiations in Miami. The content of these meetings is unknown, but some Western officials suggest that the contacts could have been used to pressure Kyiv, including discussing the possibility of amnesty from corruption charges. Why? You know, I am not inclined to discuss conspiracy theories because they do not know what the Federal Bureau of Investigation can give anyone a pardon. I fully admit that the tough measure, as a sector of the National Defense Security Council, had something to talk about with representatives of the American Special Services. But again, we should think that the Ukrainian leadership can make some decisions behind the back of the Ukrainian people. It's ridiculous. We're not in Russia or here. Therefore, it is not even worth discussing at all, but we are discussing it. They are essentially law enforcement agencies, one way or another, security agencies. There were some instructions from Zelensky that needed to be discussed at the FBI. Well, you are in moderation in this discussed. That's it. It doesn't matter at all what kind of contacts take place there. And there are always some contacts at the level of intelligence communities. And that's why they happen, so that no one knows the details. The European Union has left Russian assets frozen until the end of the war. However, several EU countries opposed them. They were supported by UK banks. The objections relate to legal risks, possible counterclaims from Russia, as well as the applicant for future international financial relations. To what extent, in your opinion, does this split the European Union, and how do you assess the chances that the decision on the indefinite freezing of assets at the upcoming EU summit in Brussels will resolve the issue in favor of Ukraine? The decision on the indefinite freezing of assets has already been made. Now, in order to transfer the so-called repatriation loan to Russia and Ukraine, it is necessary to achieve a qualified majority of the votes of the participants and the European Union. This is not a unanimous vote. To date, there is a qualified majority. 5 days before the EU summit, if 3 or 4 more countries do not appear in these 5 days, and among which there should be some even larger country that will oppose the reputation credit, it will be granted. And there will be no split, just some countries will speak out against it. If there are enough countries to block this decision, it will be blocked, and there will be a search for other options. That's it. Vitaly Eduardovich, do you consider the financial military support of the United States and Great Britain as compensation for non-compliance with the Budapest Memorandum? Or can Ukraine resolve this issue in court after the end of the war? No, it can't. The Budapest Memorandum does not provide for such procedures. He had expected some assurances of support and not a guarantee of safety. At least that's what it says in the English text. And, in principle, it was based on the fact that then no one in Ukraine, and even in the United States, could imagine who could attack Ukraine. Do you understand? Therefore, it is written out in such a way that everyone can interpret it as they like, although it is absolutely clearly written there that the guarantor countries must protect Ukraine from the use of force. But one can ask from the use of force by whom? Does this include the countries themselves, the guarantor countries themselves? Or it's third countries that haven't joined the Budapest team? I mean, it's such a document, which of course you can bring as a factor in the fulfillment of its obligations. And, by the way, I assume that failure to fulfill these obligations under the Budapest Memorandum will lead to the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the world sooner or later. In order to avoid this, Ukraine just has to be captured from Russia. But there are no legal possibilities to appeal to the obligations of the Allies. I would like to ask you one more question that concerns our country. On November 29th, an attack was carried out on the CPC berth in Novorossiysk, after which the Kazakh Foreign Ministry protested to Ukraine, accusing it of hitting civilian objects. To be honest, I haven't seen any confirmation that Ukrainians did it. And 2 days ago, the SBU reported strikes on the Lukoil platform in the Caspian Sea. Lukoil exports oil from this field through CPC. The Kazakh foreign minister said that he had discussed the CPC issue with the head of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry. And it was understood that the situation should be stable. I do not know what it means. But my question is, why, in your opinion, is Kazakhstan making claims to Ukraine and negotiating with your country, and not with Russia, which started this war? Well, yes, this is because it is easier to negotiate with Navich, with Russia, because Russia will never talk to Kazakhstan about this. But on the contrary will demand from Kazakhstan that it condemn the Ukrainian actions. But at the same time, you know that this month Kazakhstan for the first time sends their 50,000 tons of oil from the Kashagan field directly to China without using Novorossiysk. And this is a very important point, because it seems to me that everyone in Astana should already make sure that the Russian routes are not reliable. And again, this is not the fault of Ukrainians, this is not the fault of Kazakhstanis, this is the fault of Russia, which has turned the post-Soviet space into a zone of economic instability. I want to remind you that up to 2014 year, everything was perfectly supplied everywhere. New routes were being developed along all routes, and the Ukrainian gas transportation system was working. No one was going to give up on mutual obligations. Who started this war? Russia has unleashed, of course. Well, it is clear that Kazakhstan, like other Caspian countries, would like security on the Caspian Sea. That's for sure. But again, we must understand that we must think with you about how this security is combined with the fact that Russia is, in fact, a belligerent power. Vitaly Eduardovich, Belarusian political prisoners were released yesterday, but one of the most famous, of course, is Maria Kolesnikova, Viktor Babarika. They were taken to Ukraine. Why? Well, as far as I understand, these were the agreements of the United States to make it happen on Ukrainian soil. Perhaps there were some questions about the transportation of these people to the EU countries. This is again a question of the American-Belarusian dialogue, so that this exactly happens on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. I think that would make sense. It is necessary to ask the Americans why they have not established effective cooperation in terms of the deportation of Belarusian political prisoners. By the way, I want to remind you of forced deportation, because no one asks people if they want to stay in Belarus or leave. Here in the European Union or in Ukraine. That is, there are some, I think, motives that we simply do not know. Maybe someday we will find out. Maybe it has something to do with Lukashenko himself. Maybe it has to do with the closure of the borders of Belarus, the European Union. They can be at different times. And you don't think that other dictators will adopt this method of, well, I would even say, human trafficking. Well, you might think that it was Lukashenko who invented it. Nicolae Ceausescu, President of the Socialist Republic of Romania and General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party, mastered this art when Lukashenko was still serving in the Soviet army, if not earlier. He traded ethnic Germans with Germany for loans. He traded Romanian Jews with the West for loans to Romania. He traded political prisoners. He is all the time people were selling. And not necessarily people who were in prisons, but just people who would like to leave Romania. By the way, Lukashenko has not mastered this art yet. Do you understand? Because Lukashenko simply releases people from prisons, and there it was necessary to pay money. Just to have some Romanian citizens of German origin leave Germany, or Romanian citizens of Jewish origin to Israel. All the time it was necessary to pay off how? Well, Ceausescu could perfectly replace the economic development of human trafficking. Any authoritarian regime trades people, is nothing new in this. So how can they adopt? They have been adopting authoritarianism all the time throughout their existence, because these are regimes for which, as we understand it, human life is a bargaining chip. I asked you about this because there are political prisoners in Kazakhstan too. Of course, not in such a huge amount as in Belarus, but nevertheless there are. And our human rights activists initiated a letter sent by a European parliamentarian with a request to discuss with the Kazakh authorities the issue of exchanging Kazakh political prisoners for a Kazakh spy caught in Poland in the summer, who worked as an assistant to the military attaché at the embassy of Kazakhstan in Ukraine. How do you assess such chances? I think they are smaller than in the case of Lukashenko, because Kassym-Jomart is absolutely calmly maneuvering between the West and China and Russia, as you can see. And Alexander Lukashenko is perceived in the United States as the president of the country of the Russian peninsula. And, as far as I understand, Trump wants, let's say, to distance Belarus from Russia. To give Lukashenko the opportunity to maneuver, something like he wants to distance Russia from China. Therefore, he understands all the different steps of this type. And then I do not exclude that this is part of a scheme of some kind of financial cooperation. The future? Through Belarus, if it is not possible to reach an agreement with Russia, if it continues the war, but it wants to cooperate with Russia, then Belarus can become such, I would say, a hub for American-Russian cooperation. I do not claim that it will be so, but I claim that there is such an idea. In this sense, Kazakhstan less likely to be perceived that way. As you see now, Kazakhstan. We haven't seen each other for probably 2 or 3 months. Has something changed in your vision? I think that in countries like Kazakhstan, little changes in 3 months. You know that. In countries with controlled societies of essentially irremovable power, nothing changes for a decade. Then, something changes in one day, as, by the way, it has repeatedly happened in the history of modern Kazakhstan. So far, this one day has not happened. And what is the mood in Ukraine now? Well, we cannot qualify any common moods with you, because each person is in his own, I would say, circle. May not really understand what is happening in neighboring circles. There is a sociology, in principle, shows the willingness of Ukrainians to hold on, and that they absolutely do not want to capitulate to Russia. But it is clear that it is difficult for people to be in such a situation indefinitely. And this also affects the situation in Ukrainian society, of course. Vitaly Eduardovich, thank you very much. I would like to say that I am always happy to communicate with you and always listen to you. Friends, there is a link to Vitaly Eduardovich's channel in the description of my broadcast. I would also like to inform you that I have announced a collection for the Ukrainian doctors who need medication and funds for the treatment of wounds of the wounded defenders of Ukraine. You will also find the details in the description of my broadcast. Thank you all for being with us, and thank you again, Vitaly Eduardovich. Goodbye.